we're going to explore a rule of life, this ancient concept going back to the 4th or 5th century, where you built a set of practices that guided your whole life. Now, this is really dealing with the abiding life that Jesus talks about in John 15, to abide in him. He will abide in you. But the question then for us is, how do we abide? And again, for centuries, there's been one answer that got lost for a while and then has been recovered in recent years: the rule of life. Now, when we think of rule, don't think of a set of rules. The word in the Latin actually described a trellis. It was the word regula, and it meant something that guided growth. So a trellis in a garden is a form that helps something like a clematis or a vine or whatever grow up and toward the light. And if it's a fruit-bearing thing, to bear greater fruit. It's not a static concept, the rule, a set of, here's the things you can and can't do. It's very dynamic. It's about a living thing and how to enhance the beauty of that living thing, the fruitfulness, the abundance, etc. G.K. Chesterton said, "The more I considered Christianity, the more I found that while it has an established rule and order, the chief aim of that order was to give room for good things to run wild." So that's getting at the idea that there is a vine is going to grow, whether it's growing on the ground or not. It's going to bear fruit, grapes, for instance, whether it's growing on the ground or not. It just isn't going to bear as much. Many of those grapes will be vulnerable to insect and rot, and they're just not going to be as abundant. They're not going to be as sweet. They're not going to get up into the sun the way they need to. So a trellis or regula, a rule, is going to give guidance to what wants to grow anyhow. Having said that, let me clarify that the life is never in the rule itself, never in the structure that we give to it. We are not running around. It's like the Sabbath, that we are not made for the Sabbath, but the Sabbath for us. The rule is made for us. It's made to serve us, to keep us flourishing in a place of growing, in a place of deepening. It is a way of directing our God-word energies toward the greatest light, the greatest beauty, the greatest fruitfulness. What is it that allows me to flourish? What is it allows me to be abundant, to bear the fruit that Christ would have me bear? Now, spiritual disciplines are what we collect into a rule, and not just spiritual disciplines, as we've been talking about just life itself, your physical practices, your being a friend, your making meals, your making beds, all of these things gathered into a rule. But we want to have some economy around how we do that, and we'll get into that later on in the course. But these practices, these disciplines that are collected into a rule, a collection of ways we're going to engage with life, are not about our willpower, just trying harder. There is effort, but it's not just about, I'm going to grit my teeth and clench my fists. I'm going to try harder. A rule of life is actually about disarming and subverting your won't power. It's a phrase from John Ortberg, that my won't power, my refusal to grow, my refusal to flourish, tends to be stronger than my willpower, my choice to be this saint. So a rule of life is actually disarming and subverting won't power. Or what Paul talks about in Romans 7, where he says, what a wretched man I am. The things I want to do, I don't, and the things I don't want to do, I do. That's really a description of won't power. And then he goes on, the Apostle Paul in Romans 8, to talk about a life of flourishing, about this Christ-likeness and growing in a life in the Spirit and hearing the Spirit, and the Spirit testifying with my spirit that I'm truly a child of God. So let me give you an example. Everyone prays. Everyone prays, but all of us at some point kind of hit a rut in our praying where we're not hearing God, we're not enjoying being in the presence of God. We're easily distracted in our prayers. It's not doing what prayer is supposed to do, is cultivating primarily an intimacy with God, a deep attentiveness to God, this turn toward God, this Godwardness, and then cultivating an appropriate dependency. And by appropriate dependency, I mean we're to grow up. We're not to be like little infants, dependent in every way, but there's a sense of my need for God in life in general. A prayer life is measured by greater clarity, greater humility, greater boldness, greater joy, etc. Now, a rule of life creates the conditions for flourishing. So let's take the example of prayer. Let's say my prayer life has gotten stagnant. It's just stalled out. It's got into a rut. What I would do in my rule of life is I would say, do I need to change that up in some way? Is there some new discovery I need to make in prayer, or do I have to go back to some ancient way of praying? Recently, I have developed a practice of long meditation on a single psalm every day, and I'll read the psalm over and over. I'll pray the psalm over and over until, in a sense, it's become my own. And so I'm going back to the ancient prayer book of the people of God of Israel, and I'm living into those prayers, and I'm finding a profound connection with God after having gone through a season where it felt kind of dry in my prayer life. It feels alive again. So a rule of life is the set of practices, but they're not static. They're changing according to your season of life, your age, your stage, all of those sorts of things. A rule of life is also about stewarding conditions, and that's maybe another way of saying it. It's what is going on in my life right now? What's my physical health like? What is my financial situation like? Where's my marriage at, or my relationships with significant others at? How do I take the conditions of my life and steward them well toward this life that's turned toward God? An illustration that might help with this, I read about this phenomena in Death Valley where the scientists were deeply, deeply puzzled for many years because there's these massive rocks on the floor of Death Valley. And sometimes these rocks would be moved and significant distances, like 300-400 yards, they had been moved. And you could see the trail that they had carved in the sand as they'd been moved, and no other evidence of anybody moving them or any machinery. You're talking like several ton rocks. And it puzzled scientists, how did these rocks move from one place to the other? Was it some kind of alien intervention? And then they discovered that in Death Valley, there would be, as night set, a kind of a light dew that would settle onto the sands, and then it was so cold that it would freeze, so it'd be icy, and then a wind would come up and it would push these massive rocks along. The conditions were just perfect for what seemed impossible to become possible. A rule of life is stewarding conditions. It's taking what's going on in your life, the good and the bad of it, and it's finding ways to make what seems impossible possible. A season where you don't seem to be able to connect with God, your rule of life will help you kind of move things forward in a way that just simply just trying harder isn't going to do. As I've already talked about, a rule of life is also about not just practicing our faith, but faithing our practices. Looking at what we're already doing. We're walking, we're jogging, we're knitting, we're resting, we're doing dishes, etc. And how can that become a locus of some kind of formation where I'm opening my yes to God, A rule of life also fits who you are. It's custom designed. It's kind of the yoke that's been shaped to fit your shoulders, your personality, your season of life, your sense of call, your specific gifting. It has to fit you. So somebody else's rule of life it can be adapted, you can learn from it, but it's not going to fit you. It has to be a yoke particularly adapted to you. Now, let me just make a note at that point that in its origins, a rule of life coming out of I think I said earlier, 5th century, but I think 6th century, the Benedict of Nursia developed the rule of life, and it was really a collective rule. It was a communal rule. It was for a group of monks, not for the individual. And it wasn't like you adapted or each person had their own rule of life. It was something that the entire monastic community would practice. That, for most of us, isn't practical anymore. Our moment in culture, if you're living in North America in the 21st century, is so individualistic. It's not communal. So we're, in a sense, taking a concept that had a context historically, and we're moving it into the moment, and we're saying that probably the best we can do is just have your personal rule of life. What I would just say to you is, for further reflection, what would it look like to develop a rule of life that was more communal, maybe for your entire household, maybe with a group of friends? I think it would be a great exercise for an entire church to think about cultivating or developing a rule of life that was for the entire community. It's best to view spiritual formation not as a series of distinct steps. That was actually one of the problems with the classic models. It just sort of envisioned moving in a series of steps toward greater Christ-likeness, greater enlightenment. It's better to view spiritual formation or all formation as a series of movements. This comes from Henry Nouwen, that we're moving from fear to courage. We're moving from solitude to community. We're moving from a kind of a death to life. He talks about the movements, but within movements there can be lapses, reversions, new seasons, etc. So the rule of life is adapted to these movements in our life. One of the ways to think about this is from Mark's Gospel, chapter 4, the famous parable of the seeds and the soils, where Jesus talks about a farmer went out and he scattered seed here, there, and everywhere, but it fell on different kinds of soil. Some of the soil was rocky, it just couldn't take root. Some was shallow, it did, but it quickly dried up and died out. Some was weedy, so it got choked, and then some was very loamy. It was soil that produced a great harvest. And in the parable, it seems that these are different kinds of people. That's how Jesus explains it, that there's a greater receptivity to the seed of the gospel, to the seed of God's presence in some hearts than in others. And I think that's obviously a valid way to read that parable. But another way to understand that parable is it's describing seasons of our own lives, where there's a season where we may have very soil that's produces, it's rich, it's deep, it produces great fruit. And then for something goes on in our life that it becomes weedy and it starts to choke it, or it becomes shallow and things can't take root as much. Or even think about this, maybe the parable describes you at any given moment. There's probably, for some of you, you can identify parts of your life right now that are very, very fruitful, that you just throw a seed in and it has a 30, 40, even 100 yield, 100% yield to it. It just produces a lot. Maybe something's going on in your personal relationships and it feels very, very fertile, very flourishing. But there's other parts of our life right now, less so. Maybe something at work, maybe some struggle you're having in your health that just feel like it's become shallow soil. A rule of life is going to be adapted to all of that. It's going to attend to these, not just seasons of your life, but these parts of your life, the parts that are flourishing, the parts that are choking out the seed, the parts that seem too shallow, the parts that seem stony. And you're shaping this rule of life, changing things up as you need to try to create a fruitfulness in every part of your life, or as I've been describing it, this turn toward God, this turn toward the light, this place where what's happening in your life is reflected in your face. A rule maybe is summed up best in the words of Proverbs 4:23. Above all else, guard your heart, for it is a wellspring of life.